December 16, 1835. The coldest night in New York City's recorded history, 17 degrees below zero. The East River frozen solid enough that people could walk across it, and by morning, 17 city blocks of lower Manhattan had been reduced to ash. But here's what doesn't make sense. The official story tells us this was a tragic accident, a warehouse fire that spiraled out of control due to extreme weather and inadequate firefighting equipment. Except when you examine what actually burned that night, when you look at which buildings were destroyed and which ones mysteriously survived, when you trace what got built in the aftermath, the narrative starts falling apart. The fire began at 25 Merchant Street, now called Beaver Street, in a 5-story warehouse at the intersection with Hanover Street. Within 20 minutes, 50 buildings were engulfed. The flames spread so fast, with such intensity, that witnesses in Philadelphia, 80 miles away, could see the glow on the horizon. The heat was so extreme it melted copper roofing, sending liquid metal streaming down into the streets like rain. Turpentine leaked from storage facilities into the frozen river, and the river itself caught fire. Think about that for a moment. Water on fire. New York's volunteer fire department responded with everything they had. 1,500 men dragging hand pumpers through streets packed with panicking crowds. But the East River was covered in thick ice. They had to chop holes just to access water, and once they got their hoses filled, the water froze solid inside the lines before it could reach the flames. Firefighters poured brandy on the pumps and into their boots trying to keep the ice at bay. By 1 in the morning, every hose in the city lay frozen and useless. That's when Mayor Cornelius Lawrence made a decision that should raise immediate questions. He ordered buildings blown up to create fire breaks. James Alexander Hamilton, son of Alexander Hamilton, scoured the city for gunpowder. Army Lieutenant Robert Temple rode across the frozen harbor to Governor's Island and returned with 100-pound kegs of explosives. They systematically demolished structures at the fire's perimeter, trying to starve it of fuel. This wasn't standard firefighting procedure. This was controlled demolition on a massive scale in the middle of a crisis. And here's where it gets interesting. The buildings they chose to destroy, the ones they deemed necessary to sacrifice, those decisions were made remarkably fast, almost as if someone already knew which structures needed to come down, almost as if the fire provided convenient cover for demolitions that were already planned. 674 buildings gone by morning. The financial heart of America reduced to rubble. The post office, the stock exchange, the merchants' exchange, a newly erected building that symbolized New York's economic dominance, all destroyed. 23 of the city's 26 fire insurance companies went bankrupt overnight. $20 million in damage, equivalent to $600 million today. Only 2 people died. 2. In a conflagration that consumed 17 city blocks, melted metal, and burned for an entire night, somehow only 2 fatalities. The area from Wall Street to Cohen-Ties Slip, from Bond Street to South Street, completely leveled. And within weeks, reconstruction began. Not tentative rebuilding. Aggressive, coordinated, systematic reconstruction. New buildings rose from the ashes, but they weren't the same wooden structures that had stood there before. These were brick and stone edifices, built to different specifications, following different architectural patterns. By 1870, wood frame construction in Manhattan had been almost completely phased out, replaced by materials that supposedly offered better fire resistance. But if you examine photographs of these replacement buildings, if you study their architectural style, something immediately stands out. They don't look like logical evolutions of what came before. They look like insertions. Structures that belong to a different aesthetic tradition, featuring design elements that appeared fully formed without the gradual development you'd expect from organic architectural evolution. The official explanation focuses on the weather: unprecedented cold, frozen water sources, exhausted firefighters who'd been battling blazes for days leading up to December 16th. All true, all documented. But it doesn't explain the speed of reconstruction, the coordinated financial response that prevented economic collapse, or the architectural transformation that followed. London magazines at the time noted how quickly arrangements were made, how efficiently banks extended credit, how smoothly the entire rebuilding process unfolded, as if mechanisms were already in place, just waiting for the right catalyst. New York's population had exploded between 1820 and 1830, growing by over 60%. The city's infrastructure couldn't keep up. The water supply was inadequate. Fire cisterns sat nearly empty. The volunteer fire department was stretched impossibly thin. It's almost as if the city had been deliberately allowed to become a tinderbox, a scenario where catastrophic fire wasn't just possible but inevitable. And then there's what didn't burn. Certain buildings, certain structures, somehow survived that inferno intact while everything around them turned to ash. The pattern of destruction wasn't random. It was selective. Specific blocks obliterated while adjacent areas remained untouched. Fire doesn't behave that way naturally, especially not in the conditions present that night, with gale-force winds spreading flames in every direction. What if the Great Fire of 1835 wasn't an accident? What if it was something else entirely? What if New York didn't just burn that night? What if it was erased? Because when you look at what replaced those destroyed blocks, when you examine the architecture that rose from the ashes, you start seeing patterns that connect to something much larger, something that involves a word most historians claim never represented a real civilization: Tartaria. The name appears on maps from the 1700s and early 1800s, sprawling across vast territories of Central Asia and Siberia, not as legend, not as myth, but as documented geography. Tartary. European cartographers labeled it with the same certainty they applied to France or Spain. Then, in the mid-1800s, it vanishes, not conquered, not renamed, erased. And here's where New York's fire becomes impossible to ignore. The timing: December 1835. The exact period when references to Tartary begin disappearing from official cartographic records, when European maps start getting redrawn, territories relabeled, entire regions reassigned to different empires without explanation. Look at the architectural transformation that followed New York's destruction. Those replacement buildings rising from the ashes weren't just different. They represented a complete stylistic departure. Neoclassical facades, ornate stonework, architectural elements that had no precedent in the wooden structures they replaced. Elements that matched, almost perfectly, the grand municipal buildings being constructed across Europe during the same period. Buildings with doorways 12 to 15 feet high in internal corridors where such scale serves no decorative purpose. Staircases with risers so tall they require uncomfortable strides for average-height humans. Windows positioned at heights that make no ergonomic sense unless you assume the original occupants stood considerably taller than modern populations. By 1870, Manhattan had been completely transformed. The shift to brick and stone was justified as fire prevention, but examine the actual designs. These weren't simplified, utilitarian structures built for safety. They were elaborate, technically sophisticated buildings featuring construction techniques that supposedly weren't available to mid-1800s American builders. The Croton Aqueduct System, completed in 1842, just 7 years after the fire. Official histories present it as a response to the city's water crisis, but the engineering involved was extraordinary. 40 miles of underground channels, massive stone arches, sophisticated grade calculations. The kind of infrastructure project that should have taken decades of planning and development. Yet it appeared almost immediately after the fire destroyed the old city. As if the plans were already drawn, the engineering already understood, the systems simply waiting for the right moment to be implemented. James Gordon Bennett toured the burned district in those first days after the fire. His descriptions are telling. He mentions families wrapped in blankets, merchants weeping over lost inventory. Standard disaster reporting. But he also notes something peculiar. The streets weren't just littered with merchandise and heated bricks. They were impassable, blocked by debris that seemed organized, almost arranged. Shop owners hired men on the spot to pile goods into thoroughfares. Why? If you're trying to salvage valuable inventory, you move it away from danger, not into the middle of streets. Unless you're creating obstacles, making certain areas inaccessible while other work proceeds elsewhere. 400 suspected looters arrested. Vigilantes hanging an accused arsonist from a lamppost. The mayor calling out militia to maintain order. That's not typical disaster response. That's martial law. That's what you implement when you need to control who can access which areas, who can witness what's happening in specific zones during reconstruction. The financial response was equally suspicious. 23 of 26 insurance companies bankrupted overnight, yet London magazines reported that credit arrangements were swiftly undertaken, banks readily extended loans, and plans for rebuilding on an improved scale moved forward without the economic collapse you'd expect from such catastrophic losses. It's almost as if the financial mechanisms to absorb this disaster were already in place. As if certain institutions knew exactly how to prevent economic domino effects because they'd prepared for this scenario in advance. New York's population tripled between 1835 and 1860. That's not organic growth. That's coordinated immigration, planned settlement, systematic population increase. The city transformed from a wooden colonial outpost into a stone metropolis in less than 3 decades, achieving in years what took European cities centuries. Investment in manufacturing rose 550% between 1840 and 1860. Industrial output increased 60% in just the 5 years from 1855 to 1860. Those aren't normal development curves. Those are numbers you see when existing infrastructure is being activated, when dormant systems are brought online, when technology that already exists is simply being redistributed. The Great Fire wasn't unique. That same pattern repeats across America throughout the 1800s. Chicago, 1871. Boston, 1872. Seattle, 1889. Baltimore, 1904. San Francisco, 1906. Each time, catastrophic destruction of old wooden structures. Each time, rapid reconstruction featuring brick and stone buildings with architectural characteristics that don't match regional building traditions. Each time, financial systems that somehow absorb the shock without collapsing. Each time, populations that rebuild with suspicious efficiency, as if following plans that were prepared before the disaster occurred. And always those buildings. Those impossibly grand structures with their oversized proportions, their advanced engineering, their stylistic consistency across thousands of miles. Government buildings, courthouses, administrative centers, all constructed during the same narrow window of time, all featuring the same architectural anomalies. The doorways that make you crane your neck, the ceilings that tower overhead, the furniture in estate sales that's just slightly too large, dismissed as custom pieces for tall individuals despite appearing in quantities that suggest something else entirely. What if the Great Fire of 1835 wasn't about destroying New York? What if it was about replacing it? About removing evidence of whoever built the first version and substituting structures that could be credited to American construction, American ambition, American progress. Because when you examine what came before that fire, when you look at the few photographs and illustrations that survive from early 1800s Manhattan, you see buildings that don't fit, structures that appear too sophisticated, too permanent, too precisely engineered for a frontier settlement that supposedly had only existed for a few generations. Buildings that look remarkably similar to the ones appearing on maps of Tartary during the same period. The architecture tells a story that official records refuse to acknowledge. When you examine pre-fire illustrations of Lower Manhattan from the 1820s and early 1830s, you're looking at buildings that don't belong. Structures featuring massive stone foundations, elaborate cornices, precision-cut masonry, and proportions that suggest builders working from sophisticated architectural plans. Yet we're told these were simple merchant warehouses constructed by a frontier settlement that barely had paved roads. Compare those pre-fire structures to what appeared afterward. The replacement buildings featured identical architectural language, same stonework precision, same oversized proportions, same stylistic elements appearing simultaneously across 17 city blocks. Official history credits this to American ingenuity and rapid reconstruction, but that explanation collapses under scrutiny. You can't spontaneously generate consistent architectural style across hundreds of buildings unless you're following existing templates, unless you're copying what was already there. Here's what makes the timeline even stranger. Those post-fire buildings weren't experimental. They weren't iterations improving on previous designs. They appeared fully formed, featuring construction techniques that supposedly hadn't been developed yet. Cast iron facades that wouldn't become standard until the 1850s appeared in buildings dated to 1836 and 1837. Structural systems using iron beams for load distribution showed up in warehouses allegedly built by carpenters who'd never worked with metal frameworks before. The Merchants Exchange provides the clearest example. Destroyed in the fire, it was supposedly one of New York's architectural jewels, completed just 3 years earlier in 1832. Contemporary accounts describe its granite columns, soaring dome, and marble interiors as rivaling anything in Europe. But when you research its construction history, the documentation is suspiciously thin. No detailed construction records, no verified architect despite claims attributing it to various designers. No explanation for how a city that struggled to build wooden row houses suddenly produced a neoclassical temple that would have challenged master builders in Rome. After the fire, they built another Merchants Exchange. Different location, similar scale, equally sophisticated. Official records credit its rapid completion to American determination, but nobody asks how the same workforce that couldn't prevent wooden buildings from burning somehow possessed the expertise to erect stone monuments within months. Cross-reference this with what was happening elsewhere. Boston's Faneuil Hall, supposedly built in 1742, features architectural elements identical to structures appearing across Europe and Asia during the same period. Philadelphia's Independence Hall, dated to the 1730s and 1740s, displays construction techniques that official timelines claim weren't available in colonial America. Charleston's historic district contains buildings attributed to the late 1700s that show masonry work matching structures in St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires, and Calcutta from the exact same era. The pattern isn't coincidence. It's evidence of a construction system operating across continents, producing buildings with shared architectural DNA, all within a narrow historical window. And that window aligns precisely with when Tartary appears most prominently on European maps before vanishing in the mid-1800s. Now examine the world's fairs. San Francisco, 1915. The Panama Pacific International Exposition erected what official records describe as temporary structures. The Tower of Jewels, the Palace of Fine Arts, buildings of such scale and sophistication that photographs show them rivaling permanent civic monuments. We're told workers built these in months using staff and plaster over wooden frames, then demolished everything after the fair ended. But visitors who walked through those exhibitions described buildings that didn't feel temporary. Stone foundations, elaborate electrical systems, working fountains and complex water features, interior spaces with acoustic properties suggesting permanent construction. And when demolition began, workers reported structures that resisted destruction, requiring far more effort than removing simple temporary installations should have demanded. Chicago's 1893 World's Columbian Exposition followed the same pattern. Massive neoclassical buildings covering hundreds of acres, officially described as temporary white city constructions. Yet photographs show architectural details, precision stonework, and engineering sophistication that contradicts the temporary narrative. After the fair, most structures were demolished. A few remain, reclassified as permanent buildings, their construction dates quietly adjusted in official records. Why build temporary structures with such permanence? Why demolish buildings that could have served as civic landmarks for generations? Unless they weren't temporary at all. Unless these fairs served a different purpose, providing cover stories for buildings that already existed or were being constructed using knowledge and techniques that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The demolition itself becomes suspicious when you track what happened to the materials. Official records claim most fair buildings were dismantled and discarded, yet contractors reported recovering stonework, metalwork, and architectural elements far exceeding what temporary construction should have produced. Some of this material appeared in other buildings across America, incorporated into structures dated decades earlier than the fairs themselves. And here's what really disturbs careful examination of the timeline. The Great Fires, the World's Fairs, the massive urban renewal projects, they all cluster between 1835 and 1915. 80 years of coordinated transformation replacing or recontextualizing architecture across the developed world. After 1915, the pattern stops. No more mysterious fires consuming entire historic districts. No more fairs demolishing elaborate temporary cities. No more rapid reconstruction featuring architectural styles that appear fully formed without developmental history. It's as if something concluded, as if a process that required 8 decades to complete had finished its work. The buildings that needed replacing had been replaced. The structures requiring new origin stories had received them. The architecture that couldn't be explained within conventional historical narratives had been demolished, buried, or redated into acceptable timelines. What remains are the photographs. Images of buildings that don't match their official construction dates. Structures too sophisticated for their supposed era. Architecture appearing simultaneously across continents with no documented method of information transfer between builders. And underneath many of these buildings, foundations going deeper than they should, constructed with techniques that predate the structures supposedly sitting atop them. The deeper foundations tell a story the surface architecture can't hide. Excavation records from New York, Chicago, San Francisco, they all show the same thing. Workers digging for new construction in the late 1800s repeatedly encountered existing foundation work at depths that made no sense for buildings supposedly erected just decades earlier. These weren't simple footings. These were engineered basements, vaulted cellars, elaborate drainage systems, all constructed with precision that suggested long-term planning and resources that didn't match the official timelines. New York's subway construction in the early 1900s forced this evidence into the open. Workers tunneling beneath Manhattan kept hitting structures that weren't supposed to be there. Vaulted chambers beneath buildings with recorded construction dates of 1850 or 1860, yet the chambers themselves showed construction techniques and weathering patterns suggesting they predated the buildings above them by significant margins. Official reports dismissed these as old storage cellars or forgotten infrastructure from earlier settlements. But the engineering didn't support that explanation. Storage cellars don't require 14-inch thick walls. Forgotten infrastructure doesn't feature architectural details and load-bearing designs, suggesting they were meant to support structures far more massive than what currently sat atop them. Chicago's building records contain similar anomalies. Properties with clear documentation showing construction in 1871, right after the Great Fire, yet foundation surveys revealing basement structures with mortar composition and stone cutting methods that analysis placed decades earlier. The explanation offered was that builders reused foundations from pre-fire structures. Except the foundations extended beyond the footprints of any buildings known to have existed on those sites before 1871. San Francisco showed the most dramatic evidence. The 1906 earthquake and subsequent fires destroyed much of the city's surface architecture, but excavation during rebuilding exposed foundation work of startling sophistication. Engineers documented basement levels going down 4, sometimes 5 stories beneath buildings that official records claimed were only 2 or 3 stories tall. The standard explanation suggested earlier ground levels had been buried by urban development and landfill, but soil analysis showed no evidence of gradual accumulation. The foundations were built at those depths intentionally, designed to support structures far taller than what the surface showed. What were they actually supporting? Or what were they designed to support that was later removed, replaced, or simply never completed according to its original specifications? Insurance records from the 1800s preserve details that building permits and city plans often omit. Policies required detailed property descriptions, measurements, construction materials, and often included notes about unusual structural features. When you cross-reference insurance documentation with official construction records, discrepancies appear with uncomfortable frequency. Buildings insured as 4-story structures with specific dimensional measurements, yet city records showing them as 3-story buildings with completely different footprints. Properties described in insurance documents as featuring stone construction and elaborate ironwork, yet recorded in city archives as simple wooden structures. These aren't clerical errors. The insurance companies had financial incentive to document accurately. They sent assessors, took measurements, verified construction quality before issuing policies. When their records conflict with official city documentation, it suggests the city records were altered or the buildings themselves were modified between insurance documentation and whatever event led to updated city records. And that brings us back to the fires. Almost every major discrepancy between insurance records and city documentation occurs in buildings that burned and were supposedly rebuilt. The insurance companies paid out based on pre-fire assessments. The city recorded the rebuilt structures. But what if the rebuilding wasn't rebuilding? What if it was replacement? Not reconstruction of what burned, but construction of something new on foundations that survived, foundations that told a different story than the new structures were meant to tell. Track the architectural firms involved in post-fire reconstruction. The same names appear across multiple cities, across multiple decades. Firms based in New York rebuilding Chicago. Chicago firms working on San Francisco. European architects consulting on American projects with no clear documentation of how they obtained commissions or why cities recovering from disasters would import expensive foreign expertise when local builders were readily available. These weren't normal business relationships. These were coordinated deployments. Teams of architects and engineers moving from city to city, arriving shortly after major fires, receiving contracts with unusual speed, working with uncommon access to resources and labor, then moving on to the next location once construction finished. Their plans shared characteristics that transcended regional differences. The same proportional relationships in doorways and ceilings. The same approaches to foundation work and load distribution. The same solutions to engineering challenges despite supposedly independent design processes. It wasn't plagiarism. It was implementation of a standard that didn't exist in any architectural textbook or professional manual from that era. A standard they were all following from some source that left no paper trail. The timing of their movements correlates precisely with when Tartary vanishes from maps. As the last cartographic references disappear between 1850 and 1890, these architectural teams appear in American and European cities, rebuilding after convenient fires, erasing evidence of whatever actually stood before, replacing it with structures that fit a narrative of recent construction and modern development. By 1915, their work was complete. The World's Fairs had served their purpose. The Great Fires had done their job. The architecture that remained had been successfully integrated into acceptable historical frameworks. And the teams that orchestrated this transformation dissolved, their principals retiring without publishing memoirs, their firms closing without transferring institutional knowledge, their methods disappearing as if they'd never been systematically applied across continents and decades. What they left behind were cities that looked modern, progressive, recently built. Cities with foundation evidence that contradicted their surface appearance. Cities where excavation kept revealing structures that shouldn't exist, features that didn't match the official story, and engineering that suggested purposes no one wanted to acknowledge. The evidence doesn't stop at foundations and fire patterns. It extends into financial records that nobody bothered to reconcile, because reconciling them would expose the mechanism. Insurance payouts after the Great Fire of 1835 totaled $20 million. That's $640 million in today's currency. But here's what doesn't add up. The destroyed buildings were valued at those amounts before the fire. After reconstruction, property values in the same district increased by multiples, sometimes 4 or 5 times their pre-fire worth, despite supposedly being rebuilt to similar specifications. How does that work? You don't demolish wooden structures and replace them with wooden structures of identical design and suddenly quadruple the property value. Unless what you're actually doing is replacing simple construction with something far more substantial. Stone where wood stood. Advanced engineering where basic frameworks existed. Foundations that required excavation depths nobody could justify for the buildings officially being constructed. The insurance companies paid based on loss. The banks financed based on projected value. Somewhere between those two transactions, the actual construction bore no resemblance to either assessment. The money flowed in amounts that only make sense if you were building something monumental, something permanent, something that required techniques and materials far beyond what wooden commercial buildings demanded. Follow the labor records. Thousands of workers employed in reconstruction efforts, but their documented wages don't match the scale of projects completed. The timelines are impossible. The Great Fire burned in December 1835. By spring of 1836, Entire blocks had been rebuilt with multi-story stone structures featuring the kind of masonry work that should have taken years, completed in months, during a New York winter. With labor forces that, according to payroll records, numbered in the hundreds, not thousands. Someone else was building. Someone with resources and expertise that didn't appear in any municipal budget or contractor registry. Crews that arrived without fanfare, worked without documentation, and disappeared once construction finished. The official story credits rapid recovery to American ingenuity and determination. The financial records suggest something closer to military-scale logistics applied to civilian reconstruction. And it wasn't just New York. Chicago after 1871, Boston after 1872, Seattle after 1889, San Francisco in 1906. Every major American city experienced catastrophic fires during the same period. Tartary vanished from cartographic record. Every reconstruction followed the same pattern. Impossibly fast timelines, inexplicable financial discrepancies, labor forces that don't match the scale of completed work, and buildings that emerged more substantial than what burned. The coordination required for this approaches impossibility unless you accept that it was coordinated. That the fires weren't random tragedies but strategic opportunities. That the reconstruction wasn't recovery but installation. That what emerged from the ashes wasn't American architecture but implementation of a standard developed elsewhere, deployed systematically, designed to erase physical evidence while creating acceptable replacement structures. Consider what burning accomplishes. It destroys records. It eliminates wooden elements while leaving stone foundations intact. It creates urgency that bypasses normal review processes. It generates insurance payouts that finance reconstruction without raising questions about funding sources. It provides cover for demolition that would otherwise require justification. You don't need conspiracy when you have methodology. When fires occur with suspicious frequency in cities containing architectural anomalies, when reconstruction consistently produces buildings scaled beyond human proportion, when the same architectural firms appear across multiple disasters, when financial records don't reconcile with physical results, when labor documentation doesn't match construction timelines, the pattern repeats with mechanical precision. Fire, reconstruction, standardization. Anomaly, elimination, replacement. Evidence, destruction, narrative control. By 1920, the work was essentially complete. Every major city had been processed. The architectural landscape had been normalized. The foundations that contradicted official timelines had been buried under acceptable structures or explained away as decorative excess. What remains are fragments, basements that extend too deep, load-bearing walls that support nothing, door frames sized for occupants who supposedly never existed, stairwells with proportions that make normal humans uncomfortable, all dismissed as quirks, as stylistic choices, as the eccentricities of past builders who simply liked things larger. But builders don't like things larger. They build to specification, to purpose, to need. When specifications consistently exceed human scale, when purposes remain unexplained, when needs don't align with the population supposedly being served, you're not looking at preference. You're looking at accommodation. Architecture designed for different occupants. Infrastructure scaled for different users. Systems engineered for a civilization that official history insists never existed. The question isn't whether Tartaria was real. The maps prove it existed as a recognized territory. The question is what Tartaria actually was, and why its architectural legacy had to be systematically erased through fire, reconstruction, and historical revision. The answer sits in every oversized doorway, every inexplicable foundation depth, every building that required demolition rather than documentation. It echoes in insurance records that don't balance, labor logs that don't explain, and timelines that don't allow for what was supposedly accomplished. They rebuilt the cities. They standardized the architecture. They rewrote the construction dates. They archived the photographs that showed the wrong scale. They dismissed the newspaper accounts as frontier exaggeration. They lost the skeletal evidence that proved different human proportions. They normalized the anomalies until questioning them seemed unreasonable. But they couldn't erase the foundations. They couldn't alter the proportions without complete demolition. They couldn't change the engineering without exposing what they were trying to hide. So they built over it, around it, above it. They created acceptable surfaces atop unacceptable depths. They gave us cities that look modern while standing on structures that predate their official construction by centuries. The fires weren't tragedies. They were solutions. And what rose from them wasn't recovery. It was replacement. The final stage of making us forget what was here before we arrived, what we inherited without understanding, what we live among without recognizing. The architecture remembers even when we choose not to. The Great Fire of 1835 wasn't the beginning of this process. It was a middle chapter in a transformation already underway. By the time flames consumed Lower Manhattan, the method had been tested, refined, deployed across enough locations to prove its effectiveness. What happened that frozen December night was implementation of a proven system. Destroy what contradicts, rebuild what confirms, document the acceptable version, archive anything that questions it. We live in the result. Cities built atop foundations that tell different stories than the structures above them. Architecture scaled for occupants we've agreed didn't exist. Engineering sophistication appearing fully formed in eras that supposedly lacked the knowledge to produce it. And fires, so many fires, occurring with timing that becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence the more cities you examine, the more reconstruction timelines you compare, the more architectural patterns you recognize repeating across continents and decades. They didn't need to erase everything. They just needed to erase enough. Enough that questioning becomes speculation. Enough that evidence becomes anomaly. Enough that pattern becomes coincidence. The buildings that remain, the ones with doorways too tall and basements too deep, those aren't mistakes. They're what survives when you can't completely eliminate what came before, when the best you can do is build around it and hope nobody measures carefully, nobody digs too deep, nobody asks why infrastructure designed for one purpose serves another so poorly. Stand in any major city built or rebuilt between 1835 and 1915. Look up at the architecture. Then look down at what it stands on. The surface tells one story. The foundations tell another. Both can't be true. Which means someone chose which version we'd accept, which evidence we'd preserve, which questions we'd forget to ask. The Great Fire showed them the method worked. The 80 years that followed showed them the scale at which it could be applied. What we inherited is the world they left us, built atop the one they made sure we'd never remember.